Okay, so just before class today, I did some more tweaks to the PowerPoint presentation that we're going right now, which is the one on the regulation of glomerular filtration rate. And I didn't change anything, but I added some text for clarification, okay? So that way, if you want to go back and study from that, you can read what it says, and I think it'll probably make more sense than just having a diagram there without any explanation. So this will probably be mainly a benefit to those who aren't here today that just watch the recording of this this class session. Excuse me. So this is where we left off on Monday, and so I pointed out there are three different mechanisms that regulate glomerular filtration rate, because glomerular filtration rate affects the rate at which our body excretes wastes. And if glomerular filtration rate is too low, then waste products like urea start building up in our blood, and that can become toxic. Okay? So it's important that doesn't happen, because if urea builds up in our blood, eventually that can become fatal, or it can cause organ failure, or failure of other organs. So there's three different mechanisms that regulate glomerular filtration rate. Two of these mechanisms actually are fairly complex. They involve many steps. So we're kind of getting into some material here that's some of the more difficult material I think there is in physiology. Not impossible, it just has quite a few steps. So to really get a good handle on this, I think you need to study it more than once. Okay? You can't always understand something just by listening to it one time or just by reading it one time. So, I would recommend it to listen to what I have to say today, and then we're done, read it in your textbook. If you don't understand, then come to class and ask a question, or read it again. Okay. Now there's a couple of aspects of this first mechanism called renal autoregulation that's not really explained very well in our textbook. And I had a hard time understanding it the first time I read it, so I had to do some further research, some further literature research, and then when I did that, it finally all of a sudden made sense. But I'll try to explain it today in a way that makes a little bit more sense. Okay. So we're going to go through all these mechanisms. Hopefully we'll have time to do that today. If not, we may have to finish up this last one on Friday. Okay. So we're going to start out first with renal autoregulation. Renal autoregulation refers to the ability of the nephrons to regulate or adjust their own blood flow, and thereby adjusting glomerular filtration rate, because the more blood flow there is to the glomerulus, the faster the glomerular filtration rate. Lower the blood flow to the glomerulus, slower the glomerular filtration rate. Okay? Because the more blood flow you have to the glomerulus, the higher the hydrostatic pressure there is in that glomerulus. So you have more of a driving force that's driving that filtration. Okay? And so there's two main mechanisms of autoregulation. The first one is called myogenic mechanism, and that has to do with the property of the smooth muscles in the walls of the afferent arterioles. And that's a pretty simple mechanism. That one's not too hard to understand. There's really only one step involved in that. Second one is a lot more complicated. Okay? But I'll kind of try to summarize it in a way that makes it easier to understand. All right, so the myogenic mechanism is based on the fact that when smooth muscle is stretched, it stimulates it to contract. So when blood flow to the glomerulus through the afferent arteriole, when that blood flow increases, that causes the afferent arteriole to stretch. When the afferent arteriole stretches, that stretches the smooth muscles that are in its walls. And that stimulates the smooth muscles to contract. So these circularly arranged smooth muscles contract, that causes vasoconstriction. So when blood flow to the kidneys increases, the afferent arterioles are stretched. In response to contract, that reduces blood flow to the nephrons. So that's a way, that's a type of autoregulation. Okay? Blood pressure gets too high, stretches the blood vessels, that causes vasoconstriction. That reduces GFR. Okay? Any questions? Okay. The opposite is also true though. If blood flow to the glomerulus via the afferent arteriole decreases, then the afferent arteriole is not going to be stretched as much. If the smooth muscle fibers in its walls aren't stretched as much, then they relax, and that causes vasodilation. Okay, so that's a form of autoregulation. The nephrons are regulating their own blood flow, thereby regulating the glomerular filtration rate. Now, second mechanism, which is called, has a long name, it's called tubuloglomerular feedback. This is a little more complicated, okay? And this mechanism involves an area of the nephron, which I have circled right here, called the juxtaglomerular apparatus, or JG apparatus for short. Okay? So what this is that in reality, the nephron is not shaped like it was in that diagram I showed you when we identified the different parts of the nephron. In reality, it's kind of folded in half. And it's folded in such a way that the very first part of the distal convoluted tubule, it's actually right at the junction between the ascending limb of the nephron loop and the distal convoluted tubule. As it turns out, that is the nephron is folded, so that portion of the tubule is right in between the afferent and efferent arteriole. It's right next. So this is the afferent arteriole over here on right. This is the efferent arteriole on left. So the tubule kind of doubles back, and it sits right next to that afferent arteriole. Okay, so this is the area of the juxtaglomerular apparatus. And there's several different parts to it. One of them is called the macula densa. Now, the macula densa is made up of some of the tubular cells right at the end of the nephron loop. And those tubular cells that are right next to the afferent arteriole are larger. They're longer. And those cells right here that are a little bit longer than the other ones, that's called the macula densa. Okay? And what the macula densa does is the macula densa actually monitors the composition of the filtrate that's passing through that part of the nephron. And what it does is it monitors the flow rate of fluid. Okay, if the flow rate of fluid increases because of an increase in glomerular filtration rate, then there's going to be more sodium in the filtrate. And the reason for that is if the filtrate is flowing through the nephron faster, and this is critical to understanding that. If the flow rate of the filtrate is faster, then there's not as much time for the proximal convoluted tubule to reabsorb sodium. So if there's not as much time for the proximal convoluted tubule to reabsorb sodium, not as much sodium will be reabsorbed. So that increases the concentration of sodium in the filtrate in this part of the nephron, where the macula densa is located. Okay, so the macula densa cells sense the amount of sodium, and so if they sense an increase, they call it the sodium load of the filtrate. The macula densa cells then synthesize ATP. The ATP then is picked up by another small group of cells that's right between the macula densa and the afferent and efferent arterioles, right here in the middle. Those cells, it's just a small cluster of cells. It's called mesangial cells. And so what those mesangial cells is, they take that ATP that's produced by the macula densa and they convert it into adenosine. So what they do, the way they do that is they take the 3 phosphates off of ATP, that forms adenosine. The adenosine then stimulates a third group of cells that are wrapped around the afferent arteriole. And those cells are called the granular cells, or they're also known as the juxtaglomerular cells, or JG cells. The JG cells are thought to be modified smooth muscle fibers. And so when the mesangial cells produce adenosine, that stimulates those JG cells to contract. And when they contract, that causes vasoconstriction of the afferent arteriole, which reduces GFR back down to normal. Okay, so let me try to summarize this in a little simpler way. Okay, because this really mechanism has quite a few steps, and actually it's shown on the next slide. This is what I added right over here. Okay, so let's just go through this again. Increased GFR causes an increased rate of flow through the tubules of the nephron. This faster rate of flow causes less sodium to be reabsorbed from the proximal convoluted tubule. So that decrease in reabsorption of sodium causes the concentration of sodium to increase in the distal nephron loop. Or it should, actually it's the ascending nephron loop. That increased filtered load of sodium stimulates the macula densa cells to produce ATP. This increased ATP concentration is converted by the mesangial cells to adenosine, and that adenosine then causes the JG cells to contract, causing vasoconstriction of the afferent arteriole. And the vasoconstriction of the afferent arteriole causes a decrease in GFR. Now, if you have a decreased GFR, then just the opposite is going to happen. Everything is just the reverse. Decreased GFR, you have a slower rate of movement of the filtrate through the tubules. If the filtrate moves slower, then there's more time for sodium to be reabsorbed by the proximal convoluted tubule, so there's going to be less sodium in the filtrate. That lower concentration of sodium is going to be detected by the macula densa. It's going to produce less ATP. So less ATP, you have less adenosine that's produced by the mesangial cells. If you have less adenosine, then you have less vasoconstriction. So in other words, you'll have vasodilation, just the opposite. And so that will return the GFR back to normal. Okay. So this is another example of a negative feedback system, really, that's maintaining homeostasis. So basically, this macula densa, that's it's kind of right at the junction between the ascending nephron loop and the distal convoluted tubule. that monitors the flow rate going through the tubules. And it does it by monitoring sodium levels. The sodium levels are just a way of monitoring the flow rate, because the faster the flow rate, the higher the sodium load of the filtrate. So that monitors, and so if it detects that there's an increased flow rate, then it signals the JG cells to constrict, and that reduces GFR. Okay, so I'm probably not going to ask you to, be able to recite all these steps here. I mean, I can make you do that, but you probably forget it just as soon as you took the test. I just want you to kind of understand this negative feedback system in general. Okay, I'm not going to ask you what are the molecules that signal the mesangial cells to produce adenosine, and what the compound is that stimulates the JG cells. I just want you to kind of understand how it works in general. All right. So this is a form of another form of autoregulation, but it involves a little more complex mechanism that's part of the nephron. All right. Okay. So I've got a little video clip that I found. This kind of explains a little bit differently, but it's basically the same. So this is a video from YouTube. So
the second mechanism is tubuloglomerular feedback. When blood pressure is above normal, rapid filtrate flow reduces ion retention, so filtrate in the tubule has more sodium ions, chlorine ions, and water. It is believed that when macula densa cells detect higher water and ion levels in the distal convoluted tubule, the release of the vasoconstricting chemicals from the juxtaglomerular cells is promoted. These chemicals cause vasoconstriction of the afferent arteriole, thereby reducing blood flow to the glomerular capillaries. Glomerular filtration rate decreases. When blood pressure is below normal, slow filtrate flow increases ion retention, so filtrate in the distal convoluted tubule has less sodium ions, chlorine ions, and water. Macula densa cells detect lower water and ion levels in the tubule and inhibit the release of vasoconstricting chemicals from the juxtaglomerular cells. The afferent arteriole vasodilates, increasing blood flow to the glomerular capillaries. Glomerular filtration rate increases.
Okay, that's the only part of this I wanted to show you. So one of the problems with most of the references that I've seen that try to explain this is they seem to make a leap from increased GFR and increased flow rate to increased sodium retention. That's the way they worded it in this. What I didn't understand is how does that increased GFR, how does that result in increased sodium retention? I couldn't understand that until finally I read a reference that pointed out, well, if GFR increases, the flow rate of the filtrate through the tubules increases. It's going to move through the proximal convoluted tubule a lot faster. If it moves through the proximal convoluted tubule faster, then there's not as much time for the proximal convoluted tubule to reabsorb the sodium. So that's going to leave more sodium in the filtrate. Okay, so that's how the sodium concentration increases. That increased sodium concentration in the filtrate is the signal that causes that juxtaglomerular apparatus to cause vasoconstriction of the afferent arteriole. Okay, so that's how I want you to think of it. Or if GFR rate decreases, that gives the proximal convoluted tubule more time to absorb sodium, so there's going to be less sodium in the filtrate, and so that's going to allow for vasodilation of the afferent arteriole, okay, which will bring GFR back up. All right? Any questions? Oops. mechanism that regulates GFR is sympathetic control. So sympathetic control is carried out by both the sympathetic nervous system as well as by epinephrine secreted by the adrenal medulla. And epinephrine has the same effect as sympathetic stimulation because epinephrine has the same effect as norepinephrine. So during strenuous exercise, which is one of those times when sympathetic stimulation increases in your body is under stress, or in conditions such as shock, where your blood pressure has dropped drastically, your sympathetic nerves also increase their rate of stimulation. That increased stimulation, some of those sympathetic fibers supply the afferent arteriole. So when sympathetic stimulation increases, the afferent arteriole undergoes vasoconstriction. That causes contraction. So that reduces blood flow to the nephrons. And that's going to decrease GFR, and that's going to decrease urine output. Okay? So during strenuous exercise, or if someone is in shock because their blood pressure falls to dangerous levels, sympathetic stimulation increases and GFR decreases drastically. GFR may be as low as just a few milliliters per minute, okay? Because that allows blood to be diverted to the person's skeletal muscles, which is what you need if you're doing strenuous exercise. And it also redirects blood from the kidneys to vital organs like the brain and the heart, okay? Especially if you're in shock. If you're in shock, your blood pressure is dropping to dangerously low levels. If that happens, then your brain's not going to get enough blood flow, and the person could pass out. And if blood pressure isn't returned to normal, it could cause the brain tissue to start dying. But if you decrease GFR, you can divert blood to the brain, to the heart, also to the muscles, to avoid that from happening. But you don't want that to happen for too long, because if it did, then urea is going to start building up in the blood, and it's going to start building up to toxic levels. So, in the case of shock, you would want to try to intervene to bring that person's blood pressure back up to normal, so that blood flow isn't being diverted away from the kidneys to the brain and the heart. Otherwise, other problems could occur. That decreased GFR, as I said, could cause urea to start building up in the blood. All right. Then the third mechanism is a hormonal control of mechanism. This is what some of you may have heard of before. Have any of you heard of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism? Any of you nursing students, have you heard of this before? Sometimes it actually gets introduced into some of the nursing classes before we even cover this in this class, but apparently not this year. So, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism is a hormonal mechanism involving the liver, the kidneys, and an enzyme that's found in the lining of blood vessels in the lungs, as well as it's found in the lining of blood vessels in many other parts of the body. At one time, physiologists thought that this ACE enzyme was only found in the lining of the blood vessels in the lungs, but since then they've discovered it in other parts of the body, mostly in the lining of the blood vessels. So the way this works is the liver produces an inactive enzyme or a proenzyme called angiotensinogen. And that protein is continually secreted by the liver into the plasma of the blood. So angiotensinogen is in your blood all the time. And angiotensinogen is a protein that is 453 amino acids long. So it's a fairly large protein. All right, that's just mixed in with all the other proteins in your plasma like albumin. So if you have a significant drop in blood pressure, which is going to cause a drop in GFR, your kidneys release an enzyme called renin. Now, some people mispronounce that word. Some people pronounce it renin, but renin is a different enzyme. It's pronounced. This one's pronounced renin. Renin is an enzyme that's found in milk. That's not the same as renin. So drop in GFR causes kidneys to release renin. Renin is a proteolytic enzyme, which means it can break down protein. So what renin does, renin cleaves or breaks off a piece of angiotensinogen to form a smaller peptide called angiotensin 1. And let's see, angiotensin 1 is only 10 amino acids long, so it's a real short peptide. The rest of the angiotensinogen is probably just broken down and the amino acids are recycled again. So angiotensin 1 then circulates in your blood, and as angiotensin 1 passes through blood vessels, there's an enzyme in the endothelium of blood vessels. It's most highly concentrated in the lungs, but it is found everywhere in the body. This enzyme is called angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE for short. Okay? And angiotensin converting enzyme converts angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Okay, now as it turns out, angiotensin 2 is a potent vasoconstrictor. Okay? So that causes vasoconstriction in most of the blood vessels in the body, which causes an increase in blood pressure. That increase in blood pressure then supplies the kidney with more blood that helps to increase GFR, okay, to bring GFR back up again. But angiotensin 2 also has some effects on other organs. One of them is angiotensin 2 causes the adrenal cortex to release another hormone called aldosterone. And aldosterone is a hormone that causes an increase in the reabsorption of sodium in the distal convoluted tubules of the nephrons. Now, whenever sodium is reabsorbed, water always follows sodium. So if you increase reabsorption of sodium, then you increase reabsorption of water. If you reabsorb more water, that increases blood volume. The increase in blood volume will also bring up blood pressure. Okay, bring blood pressure back up to normal. And so that increases blood flow to the kidneys. Okay. So a drop in blood pressure causes kidneys to release renin. Renin converts angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is converted into angiotensin 2 by angiotensin converting enzyme. Angiotensin 2 causes vasoconstriction of systemic vessels, which brings blood pressure back up. Also, it stimulates the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone, which increases sodium and water reabsorption. That also increases blood pressure. Okay. Then a third factor is angiotensin II also stimulates the hypothalamus to release ADH, which stands for antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone causes the distal tubules of the nephrons to increase water reabsorption. So the distal tubules increase water reabsorption. That also increases blood volume and it brings blood pressure back up again. Okay, so there's at least three different ways that angiotensin II brings blood pressure back up. And in the process, that also increases GFR. Okay, as blood pressure falls too low, your GFR is going to go down. Okay. So, I actually copied this from your textbook. These are some of the effects of angiotensin II. Angiotensin II is a potent vasoconstrictor, raising blood pressure throughout the body. It constricts the efferent arteriole, raising GFR despite low blood pressure. And it lowers blood pressure in the peritubular capillaries, enhancing reabsorption of sodium and water. It also stimulates the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone, promoting sodium and water reabsorption in the distal convoluted tubule and collecting duct. And it stimulates the posterior pituitary to secrete ADH, which promotes water reabsorption by the collecting duct. Another side effect of angiotensin II stimulates the part of your hypothalamus that controls thirst. So it makes you thirsty, which makes you want to drink water. You drink more water, that increases your blood volume, and again, that helps to bring blood pressure back up again. Okay? So, if your blood pressure increases higher than normal, let's go back to this diagram. Let's say instead of a drop in blood pressure, let's say your blood pressure goes up. Then just the opposite happens. So if blood pressure goes up, then the kidneys release less renin. With less renin, there's less angiotensin I produced. If there's less angiotensin I, then less angiotensin II is going to be produced. And so you'll have less vasoconstriction, so that will cause a drop in blood pressure. You're going to have less aldosterone produced, so you're going to have less absorption of sodium and water. That'll help to drop blood pressure back down to normal. And you'll have less antidiuretic hormone released from the posterior pituitary. And that's going to cause you to retain less water. So you're going to, instead of retaining water, you're going to excrete more water. That'll lower your blood volume, and that'll help to drop your blood pressure back down. Plus, with less angiotensin II, you're going to have less thirst, so you're not going to drink as much water, which will help prevent your blood volume from increasing further. Okay. So again, this is another example, just like tubuloglomerular feedback. That's a negative feedback system. Works. It's just a negative feedback. If blood pressure drops, the system causes blood pressure to increase. If blood pressure gets too high, it's going to bring blood pressure back down again. That's what a negative feedback system does. And so that helps to maintain homeostasis. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so Okay, so let's do a review question. Okay, so I think this is actually a different set of questions, because I think this is a new code. So you have to put in the code filter. Don't put in filter for your username though. I think sometimes students do that, and then I don't know who answered the question. So then your name doesn't show up on my attendance list. So it says, a patient with poor renal performance is given an ACE inhibitor and goes into renal failure. Which of the following is the best explanation for this? Okay, so this is sort of a medical scenario. Would this happen because the ACE inhibitor prevents sympathetic stimulation of the afferent arterioles? Is it because ACE inhibitors block the synthesis of angiotensinogen? Is it because ACE inhibitors prevent the formation of angiotensin II, which causes blood pressure and renal perfusion to fall? Or is it because too high of a concentration of ACE inhibitor was given? So, which of those is the most plausible explanation for why that patient's went into renal failure? Okay, I think everybody's answered now. We have quite a few people missing today, so. All right, let's take a look at your responses. Most of you selected number 3, and that's correct. So what an ACE inhibitor does is it blocks the angiotensin converting enzyme. So angiotensin converting enzyme can't convert angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. So that does prevent the formation of angiotensin 2, which is number 3, and without as much angiotensin 2, that's going to cause blood pressure to fall. So actually, some forms of blood pressure medication, it's actually how they work. Some forms of blood pressure medication are ACE inhibitors, and they block the conversion of angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2, and that causes your blood pressure to fall. Now, there are other types of blood pressure medications because these ACE inhibitors can have some other effects on other parts of the body that are undesirable. So there are other blood pressure medications that are used to treat hypertension that work by other mechanisms. So sometimes doctor will give a patient an ACE inhibitor, might have undesirable side effects, and so they have to resort to using a different kind of blood pressure medication. So, all right, any questions? Okay, actually, wow, I got through that fast today. That was a lot faster than I thought I would. I was worried I wasn't going to get done with this. By the way, I did finish grading the last active learning exercise, where I asked you to develop a visual analogy of the 3 mechanisms by which CO2 were carried out in the blood. And there were quite, most of them were very good. Some of them I know, I tried to do this myself using Bing Image Generator, I think was or Bing AI Image Generator. And all of the labels were, the spelling was just mangled. It was atrocious. I noticed some of that on some of yours. I didn't penalize you for that, because that's just the way, AI is not yet perfect, okay? It's one of the reasons why I need to use caution when using that. But there were some that were very good, and I don't know how they were done. They didn't look like they were done by AI, so they may have been. But anyway, I think didn't I had offer that I was gonna pick out the best visual analogy, and they would get 5 points on the next exam, okay? Actually, there were 2 of them that I liked about equally, that I thought were very good. But I'm gonna wait till Friday. I'm gonna leave you in suspense until Friday before I announce who gets the 5 points extra. So 2 people are gonna get the 5 points bonus on the next exam, okay? All right. Okay, well, that's all I have for today, so we'll stop here. You get a few extra minutes here in between the next class.